Welcome to the Athena Wellness Podcast, the show that invites you to take a seat around the community fire and listen to stories that inspire. I'm your host, Kathy Robinson, author, coach, and founder of Athena Wellness, a company that's dedicated to supporting you on your journey to live more wholeheartedly. Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for joining me. Today's conversation is about connection. Connection with our inner knowing, with our energy, and with our ancestral wisdom. It's also about creating sacred relationships, not only with our mind, body, and spirit, but with everything and everyone in our environment. I'm joined today by Brighid Murphy, who is a healer and teacher. She's also the founder of Path to Power programs, where she empowers people to heal from within. Here's what we cover: why connecting with our inner wisdom is so important, how to manage our energy and its relationship to personal power, how to use ancestral wisdom to heal ourselves, and how to create sacred relationships with the seen and unseen. We end this episode with our Dose of Inspiration segment, where Brighid shares some of the things that are lighting her up these days. I've also included a link to Brighid's website where you can learn more about her and her offerings. And now on to the show. I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right. Brighid, welcome to the Athena Wellness Podcast. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So please share a bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. I'm a transformational healer. And so I help people to transform their reality so that they can heal on all levels. I help them to move past old beliefs that are no longer serving them so that they can really step into the light of who they are and take their work into the world.
So that is not a typical job description. So tell me how you came to do the work that you do today.
Definitely not a typical job description. It's evolved, I tell you. I have been a helper my entire life. And in my late teens, I had an awareness come to me. And so I followed that prompting, I guess we could say. And through my own workings through trauma and healing myself, I started to help others to heal. And now I help other healers to take their work into the world. So it's a process that has evolved.
It's interesting when you say you had this awareness when you were in your teens. So I'm just curious about that moment, because so many times at any age, when we kind of get a sense, it's easy to dismiss, it's easy to not listen. What was it about that time in your life or the way in which this came to you that really made you pay attention? Because that's life-changing, it's life-altering.
Yes. It was a strong knowing. It was like a light bulb went off. And I remember specifically that the way, and I think information comes through to us at different times in ways that we can grasp it. And the way that it came through to me specifically was, okay, there is way too much violence in the world. Way too much violence in the world. And so it's a deep knowing, just an awareness on a heart level. And that, I think, is the best way to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think that's well said. And my guess is when you have something that stirs you that deeply, you fundamentally change, yet your outer world and your day-to-day is the same. So as a young person, how did you navigate that territory? That's not easy to do when you're older. So what was it like then going to school the next day?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I had enough teenage troubles to keep me busy.
Good point.
And I really, at that point in time, was starting to, as I was working through a lot of my own feelings and working through a lot of what was going on in my own adolescence, I started to lean into spiritual practices. And so I became more and more involved in reading about spiritual practices, finding out about drumming and healing and all of those things. And so I was on a track that was a bit different to begin with. So when this awareness came, I just kept doing what I was naturally drawn to do, which was to go toward spiritual practices.
That's universal wisdom, right? You had that safety net.
Yes.
And you've described your calling as empowering people to access their deep inner wisdom. And now I can see where that came from. But what would you say to others on why that's so important?
I have experienced that everything that we need is somewhere inside of us. It might be buried, it might be long forgotten, it might be inaccessible for a time period. And when we are looking to heal ourselves, yes, it can be helpful to have help from the outer world and help from different practitioners. And when it comes down to it, there are nuggets of information that only we can access. So when we tap into our inner wisdom, we have the opportunity to tap into the answers that we need to heal ourselves.
Yeah. And you're preaching to the converted. The whole point of Athena Wellness was Athena having both the inner wisdom and the strength, the shield and the owl. And so I love how you incorporate that into your work. But as you're talking about this inner wisdom, and this is something that I think comes up a lot, do you feel that there's a difference between your own inner knowing and what we would call spirit or oneness or universal energy? What is the link? Is it the same thing? How do you view that?
I really do believe that this question is to be answered differently depending on which lens we're looking through. So the lens that I have may be a little bit different than another person's lens, and that's absolutely perfect. I believe that our inner wisdom is connected to the larger wisdom, a deep knowing that exists inside of the hearts of people. And sometimes that knowing comes through our own intuition and our soul. And sometimes that knowing comes through outside forces like God, creator, the spirit of the wind, saints, orishas, different spirit beings from different traditions. So I think ultimately that they're all connected. And people can tap into their inner wisdom without having a structured religion or spiritual practice that they adhere to. And if people do have a structured spiritual or religious practice that they adhere to and they go deep with it, it's going to bring them back to their inner wisdom.
Mm. I heard something related to this in the next question that I have for you. It's kind of like a bridge. But just this morning, I heard this passage. Someone was talking about how the true spiritual path is just relaxing and letting go. I would call it surrendering, but the person that was speaking was calling it, this sense of relaxing into what is deeper and deeper. So there isn't a busy mind. Like that's how you get to the peaceful heart, which I thought was lovely. But something that he said was this sense of when you're going deep, it's almost like you can lean back and feel this gentle push or this support behind you. Like you can feel the energy rather than trying to make the energy. You can relax and feel that momentum. And I was like, that was just such a beautiful way of explaining how this, because it can be elusive to try to put words to it, but those feelings. And I just wonder your reaction to that.
I think that's beautiful. As you were speaking, I got a visual of a human being and the spiritual forces meeting and meshing as if the leaning back created a merging with the spiritual forces. And I do think that a lot of the quest that we have for spirituality would be easier if we did just relax mentally, emotionally, psychically. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if this was when you were younger, when you did get that true, pure sense of inner knowing, there's a calmness that comes with that,
Oh, yes.
which would relate to this sense of if we can practice in relaxation as we're meeting the everyday experiences, to remind ourselves that it's not up to us to push through something. It's up to us to meet it.
Well said. Yes.
You also have said that you help people manage their energy to be, and I love this phrase, sacred conduits. So can you share more about this? It sounds like it's related to what we were just talking about, but I'd love your perspective on that.
We have this amazing capacity as human beings to allow energy to flow through us. We don't tap into that capacity because we're busy, because we're harried, because no one's ever told us how to. And so we have a lot of energy going in a lot of different directions, getting us nowhere except for worried. And if we could wrangle our own energy and be in command of it, even just 10% more than what we are, we can create a lot of change for ourselves and the planet.
Beautiful. Talk a little bit about the connection between, we've been talking about energy. How does that relate to our personal power? Is there a relationship there? Are they two separate things? How do you think about that in your work?
Yes. And I could probably give you 5 different ways that I describe it.
All right.
So we can have a lot of energy. That doesn't mean we have power. When we have or are in our power, we are more likely to be in a good relationship with our own energy. It's kind of impossible to have your emotional and mental and psychic energies all over the place, scattered, and to be in your power. When we're tapped into and aware of where our energy is and what it's doing, and even just 10% more than we are now, we are in more of an empowered place.
And for our listeners who may not be familiar with the term, when we say coming from our power, how might we be able to describe that to them, whether it's in a situation or through example?
The 2 words that come up are confidence and strong inner knowing.
It's almost like being on your own path.
Yeah, being on your own path.
And you've mentioned trauma and healing a number of times. How does this harnessing of power or bringing it in, how does that help with healing, whether it's physically or mentally or emotionally?
When we have access to our power, when we have our energy drawn toward us or intact within us, we are more present to the insights that we will get that will help us to heal. If too many pieces of us are stuck in the past and stuck in trauma, we're in survival mode. And we're not able to fully thrive if we're in survival mode. So when we bring that energy back, whether we do it on our own or we do it through the assistance of a healer or somebody like a therapist who can help us, when we bring our energy back to us, we can move forward in more of an empowered place.
This concept was something I think it escapes a lot of folks that are in the day-to-day, because that is survival mode. And then throw our electronics on top of that, and then throw world events on top of that, and then throw a pandemic on top of that. And it feels like we're always in this fight or flight. And it's hard to connect with what we do have power over, because we can feel powerless as a result of getting battered around by our events. And so I think it's really helpful to be able to think about that, as you said, that there are things that can scatter. You can give it away. And I think that's what you were alluding to, right? You can give pieces of this away, and then it's up to us to try to find ways to bring that back in. Can you speak to that a little bit more? That something practical that somebody can be mindful of as they're going through their days.
Yes. Well, first, I would like to say that there are times in our lives where we don't have a choice. Our power needs to be surrendered for our own survival, or it's taken from somebody who has more power than us. And there are also times where we willingly give our power and our energy over to other people in relationships. So I just wanted to differentiate that there's different ways that power escapes us. And on a day-to-day basis, how can we bring our power back? How can we draw it back? First thing is to recognize that we have this energy, this power that we are distributing in places it doesn't belong. And we can take a look at where that is. Are the majority of our thoughts in places that are not helping us? Are we spending time with people who drain us? Are we doing activities or engaged in things that are not feeding us? Are we trying to help people who aren't ready to be helped? And the list goes on. So recognize where we're giving it away. And we usually know where we're giving it away because it doesn't feel good. We don't feel like juiced up when we're giving our power away. And bring attention to it. And you can almost see the strands. I can almost, if I could imagine different people in my life or situations in my life, present or past, where there's a line of energy that I'm sort of feeding them. I'm giving those things a line of energy. Do I want to be doing that? Yes or no? If I don't want to be doing that, let me draw that energy back to me. Let me draw my own energy back to me and bring my power back to me and let it rest inside me instead of outside of me.
Mm-hmm. That's very, very helpful. It's the thoughts, it's the people, it's the activities, it's the things, like you said, the things that don't feed you. And, a lot of times we hear when we're listening to self-help podcasts or reading those types of books that, oh, it's all about being happy and following your bliss and finding your passion. But really what's underneath that, the reason for that is exactly what you said. Are you being nourished in your relationships? Are you being nourished by your life? Are you making choices that are bringing you energy rather than it always being an expenditure? So I think that was very helpful to hear. And also, too, this key of feeling it in your body, because that really does seem to be the key, right? The link that you know when you're congruent or not, whether or not we want to recognize it sometimes. So can you talk a little bit about what that impact may have been over the last couple of years when we were all under enormous pressures that we've never seen before, and what that can do, those feelings versus the feelings of, I need to make some changes to be able to better connect and nourish myself?
So over the last 2 years, largely, we did not have control over what was happening. We didn't have control over the choices that were made about what was happening. And we had to surrender a lot of our power. In addition to that, the pandemic over the last 2 years caused a lot of trauma. And so we are in the process of being able to begin to clear up some of that trauma. And we really have to give time and space for that. Our nervous systems have to recover from what they just went through. And that's on top of whatever we had going on before the pandemic, on top of all of what is happening with the climate on the planet, with the racial injustices happening on the planet, all of that, right? We already were jacked up to begin with, not even to mention our personal traumas that we've experienced. So our nervous systems really need to be reset. And that has to be done intentionally if we're going to move forward.
Mm-hmm. You have mentioned the ability of community to heal the collective, and it feels like this is a perfect time to be able to do that. So as individuals living, in the greater world, how might we be able to take some responsibility and start to help folks heal the trauma that they've experienced?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing that we need to do, if we haven't already, and so many people have, is soften our hearts and recognize that we need one another. This cookie cutter reality of every person for themselves, that's got to shift so that we can start to think more about the community that we want to be in and actually engage with it. There's the sort of idealized, like, yeah, community is wonderful. And then there's the work that we need to do to move from the old paradigm to a paradigm where we are more in community. I think that's the first step, softening our hearts and leaning into doing things in a different way.
Mm. It's always hard when there's no blueprint. it almost feels like the old has kind of come down. We haven't built the new yet, and we're looking to community leaders to like, how do we do this?
Yeah.
And so I think that we're in a little bit of a spin there, because I think there's lots of ideas, but what is it that's going to get traction? And then how do people participate to be able to help create the new?
Yeah. Good question. I think that we need to look at what's already working. I think we need to look into places where community exists and it's been untainted. And that is largely, in my experience, found in Indigenous communities and in communities of color, because those communities had to stay intact. They couldn't lose who they were, or they would have not been able to survive. And I believe that the answers are there. So I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think that everyone needs to take their cue from what works already. And that is what I find and see. That those are the places that I see community has not been forgotten.
Mm-hmm. How about looking to our ancestors? You mentioned the communities that you mentioned, actually, there's a strong link to ancestral roots. So what part does that play in how we go forward? It sounds like a bit of a paradox, right? Looking back to go forward, but how might we be able to incorporate that type of wisdom?
Absolutely. And in Indigenous communities and many communities of color, there is an inherent understanding that the ancestors are a part of our everyday life. There's no separation. Just because they're not here physically doesn't mean they don't exist. And so there's a relationship that's created and can be created in the ancestral realms, having a communication with our own ancestors. Knowing that we can communicate with our ancestors is a place to start. There's a wisdom that's in the bones, and we all have bones, so we can all access that wisdom. Just if you're living in mainstream society, you're not usually taught how to do that. So we're being taught and we're being reminded of how to make those connections and those rememberings.
What might be an easy first step for somebody to either tune into their own wisdom or that of, especially folks who would love to know more about their ancestral roots? How might they be able to begin to work with that?
Yes. So holding the intention that you're curious about finding out about your ancestry. And if you don't already know where your grandparents came from, finding that out and figuring out a little bit about the customs and the culture and the history from that place. That's one idea. Another idea is to think about, for folks who grew up with any sort of traditions that came through the household, think about those and pay more attention to those, because there's often a strong connection in those traditions if they're present growing up. And then the third thing is to have something that reminds you of your ancestry visible. And it could be an old picture. It could be some piece of cloth or material that has to do with your family. It could be a food that was eaten or is eaten as part of your culture and history. Having a physical representation of your ancestry in front of you so that you can connect.
I love those three suggestions. There's something about whether it's food or whether it's something that, you experienced as a kid, especially if you can hold something that was an ancestor's. It's funny what kind of connections you're able to make, but there almost becomes an intuitive link to just things to explore today. So it's not about recreating the past, but more about little nudges, and that could lead you down a whole new pathway. So that's a lovely way of describing some of the things that you can do, and just be open to your points, the intention.
Yes, and that what you're describing right there is that inner wisdom, that intuition.
Yeah. And you take that even further because you speak a lot about creating sacred relationships. And I love that phrase as well. So beyond what we normally think of, the body, the spirit, community we've talked about, but also with things like money and your business and the natural world, that all of these things, there's opportunities to relate with what is seen and what's unseen. So I think if there's a thread that's pulling us through this whole conversation, it's relationship with things beyond our five physical senses, if that's a fair way to describe it. If you could just speak to that, I think people have probably been with us to this point, but when it gets into, well, what's a relationship like with money or with your business or with how would I be different out in the natural world? What are those relationships? How do you begin to shape and form those?
Great question. I think that recognizing that everything that is alive can be communicated with. And for everything that we can communicate with, there's a way of communicating that's receptive. So in a relationship, it goes in a couple of directions. There's an ask and a receive, a lean in and lean back. And if we would adopt that approach with the natural world, with the energy of money, with the energy of just about anything that is alive, it'll change how we interface with whatever it is. And then we are in a dialogue with it. And then we can communicate with it, and it can communicate with us. And when we're in communication, everything goes much better. We can be less controlling and even less neurotic and anxious if we're in a dialogue with somebody or something versus making up all these preconceived things we have in our head and letting ourselves run with it. So back and forth, ask and receive, communicating with, talking to energy out in nature and letting it speak back to us.
It feels like the common denominator there is silence or solitude, being able to quiet ourselves. And also we're coming back to that sense of relaxing into it, which kind of is bringing us full circle to the top of our conversation here. But I love this idea of call and response because, to your point, all of the natural forces around us it's energetic. There are energetic qualities. And even when we're creating a business, it is an act of creation. And so I think anytime that there is this act of creation, there is that opportunity for dialogue. And so when we say dialogue and we say call and response, can you give an example of what that might be like? Because it's not like you're sitting down and setting a cup of coffee in front of you and having a dialogue, right? There's a different innate type of quality. So can you speak a bit about the practical side of how someone might initiate dialogue?
Absolutely. I like to keep it simple and practical. And some of the most mystical or deep metaphysical things can be experienced with a practical approach. What does that look like? So the energy in nature is alive. How do we communicate with it? Well, we could go into some deep meditative state and bliss out, till the cows come home. Or we can walk outside to where we live or to a park or to a tree and just say like, hey, energy in the land. Hey, trees. Thanks for being here. My name's Brighid and I'm just hanging out. Of course, it sounds a little nuts. And how do relationships start? One person introduces themselves and then we roll. So this works with everything. Try talking to your money. Most people have all these ideas and thoughts about money and they're not communicating with it. How often do people say to their money, hey, thanks for filling my pocket. Appreciate you. And how would the relationship with money change if we're talking to it instead of worrying about it? We can move this into connecting with our own bodies. A lot of times people are afraid of their bodies. And if something goes wrong or if they have an illness or a sickness, they get mad or they get scared. How different would it be if we were to say, hey, body, I know you're doing the best you can. And I know that you're working through this virus and I know that it sucks and I'm listening and I'm grateful for you.
Mm-hmm.
That interaction with the body softens our approach and it will help us to communicate with our body, which will then give us information that we need for healing. So it's the same approach really with everything. Hey, how you doing? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Two things came to mind. One was when you were talking about money, my mom, who it's her birthday today, she passed about 5 years ago, and she came, as did my dad, from, families with little means. But she always, anytime you opened up her wallet, whatever cash was in there was always facing the right way. It was in denomination order. So a practice I continue to this day. There was this sense of respect. So it wasn't that this sense of there's never enough, although she really was able to do a lot with a little. But there was this sense of, I'm so grateful for what I have. And that in itself, I believe she was in dialogue without ever saying a word. The other thing that came to mind, I'm looking out my window here, trying to be more open to what the land around me is looking for me to do. And it was something as simple as walking to, there's a big tree. It's probably been here about 100 years, it's a cedar. And I didn't go up and say, hey, but I did go up intentionally and put my hand against it. And it's not, you have to walk to this tree. It's not something that you walk past, and literally could feel the energy from that trunk up my arm to my heart. I mean, I could feel it radiating. To your point, there's a lot of ways of communicating, and it's what's most natural, I think, or what feels most natural. And so if anybody's looking to try some of these things, I think any of these suggestions might be a great start of something that feels comfortable to them as they start to try it and see what happens. Like, you've got nothing to lose. And it is fascinating when you do feel that response come in whatever ways that it comes. And it's like, oh, wow, this is real.
Yes.
There's something going on here.
And when you feel it in your body, it's hard to deny it.
Yeah. One of my favorite sayings is, the life you live is the lesson you teach. And you strike me as somebody that lives their life in that manner. And so my question for you is, what lessons are you living and teaching these days?
That is a great question. The first two things that come to mind, and that I'm living into opening my heart, which is something that I'm actively doing and I'm inviting others to do, not just with my words, but with the action itself. And I think that I am living a life where I am teaching about service. And I think that service and being in service in a healthy way is one of the big remedies to the problems that we have on the planet. So heart opening and service.
Nice. We like to end these episodes with something we call a dose of inspiration, which is just a few questions for our listeners to get to know you a bit more. When are you most in your element and feel like your truest self?
I am most in my element when I am in a ceremonial space working with fire and being in a prayerful state with my community.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Lovely. What has you feeling inspired these days? What's lighting you up?
What's lighting me up is actually spending more time at home and more time with the kids in my life.
It's good energy.
It's great energy.
Yeah.
It's so good.
And what has you optimistic about the future?
Anything is possible. We're only tapping into a very small portion of possibilities. And I was shown and told through my intuitive guidance that there is information and things coming to us that we have no frame of reference for that are going to help us. And I am optimistic about that.
All right. I love that. Wow. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure our listeners will want to get in touch with you. So, Brighid, what's the best way for them to reach out?
I am on Facebook and YouTube under my name, Brighid Murphy. My website is brighidmurphy.com.
Perfect. And I'll link that all up in the show notes. And I thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your time today.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I know there are many ways you can spend your time. Thank you for choosing to spend it with me. Until our paths cross again, be kind to yourself and show your warrior spirit some love. If you know anyone who could benefit from today's episode, please pass it on. And many thanks for supporting the show by subscribing and leaving a review. It means a lot, and it helps others find their way to our circle. If you'd like to access the show notes, have a question you'd like addressed on a future episode, or would like a transcript of this episode, visit www.athenawellness.com/podcast. Until next time, be well.